Was it your testimony in direct that you observed Stephen's injuries that you testified about during the first interview? Was that your testimony?
I noticed them during the first interview, yes, sir.
Did you notice them during the interview or before the interview?
During the interview, sir.
Okay. Because to be clear, you don't ask any questions during that first interview about any injuries, right?
Yes, sir.
And to be clear, you don't take any pictures of any injuries during that first interview, right?
No, sir.
And this first interview took place sometime around 8:20-ish. Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
And that second interview that's in evidence happened sometime after 11 a.m. that same morning. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this. So if Stephen decided to say, hey, I'm done with this interview, in the middle of that first interview, would it be fair to say then that you would have no evidence of that injury that you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
You would not have been able to, you would not have asked him any questions about it, right?
Yes, sir.
You would not have taken any pictures of it, right?
Yes, sir.
In terms of an astute police investigation, would that have been a good result?
Objection, speculation.
The objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
Overtime, please, sir.
If Stephen walked away from that first interview with injuries that you noticed and which you are claiming to be important in this investigation, would that have been a good investigative result?
No, sir.
Would it be your testimony that you weren't worried about that during the first interview?
No, sir.
When you say no, sir, it wasn't a worry of yours? Or it was a worry of yours?
At that particular time, it was not a word, sir.
And why is that?
He was cooperating.
Let me ask you this. At any point in that or while he's in that interview room, during that first interview, did you tell him that he could stop answering questions and leave at any time?
No, sir.
Detective, do you claim to have something called spidey senses?
Intuition, yes, sir.
Would you call it spidey senses?
Well, that's what I call it, but it's intuition.
And when you say spidey senses, you're talking about like Spider-Man's able to sense things, right?
Well, I would classify it as intuition, yes, sir.
But when you call yourself or claim to have spidey senses, you're talking about the senses that Spider-Man has, right?
It's a figure of speech, but it's intuition, sir.
I'm trying to figure out where the phrase comes from. It's the spidey senses. Is that Spider-Man?
I object to relevance at this point.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
I refer to it as intuition.
That's not the question I'm asking, though. When you say the phrase spidey senses, what is that? Is that in reference to a cartoon or What?
No particular reference to any superheroes, sir.
Oh, so this is your original phrase of having spidey senses?
Well, you're referring to Spider-Man, and you know, my thing is I use the term spidey senses as just my way of saying intuition.
We heard you say that, but my question to you was, that's associated with Spider-Man, right? I mean, or is this something you made up, the phrase spidey senses?
I didn't make that phrase up, sir.
Where does it come from?
I don't know the originality of that.
So you're claiming that you don't know that spidey senses comes from Spider-Man having intuition?
Chair's objection, speculation, and relevance.
I sustained as to relevance.
This goes towards credibility at this point?
I think we're getting far afield, and that's why I've sustained the objection.
Because even before you interviewed Stephen, not only did you do what you testified to doing in terms of reviewing the TV Dodge report and things like that, but you also had additional information by that time, for example, about Carly's dog, right?
Yes, sir.
And that by the time you were going to interview Stephen, that dog was found out in Nahiku, right?
That morning, yes, sir.
And you took that information that morning in the context of having already known Stephen's statement about February 9, 2014 to Officer Natividad, right?
The statement that he gave Officer Natividad, yes, sir.
Right. And that statement is the one that the jury has in evidence as far as Stephen having the stalled car on the 8th and Carly helping him on the 9th, right?
Yes, sir.
So, in addition to the location that was mentioned in Stephen's statement, you also learned that Stephen was possibly the last person with her, right?
Yes, sir.
And you also had information by the time you interviewed Stephen that Carly was pregnant, right?
Yes, sir.
And that she was pregnant purportedly or reportedly with Stephen's baby, right?
Yes, sir.
But that even though she was pregnant with Stephen's baby, they had been broken up for a while. You had that information as well, right?
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't you agree with me that by the time that you interviewed Stephen on February 12th, 2014 at 8:24ish in the morning, your spidey senses were flying as far as suspicion towards Stephen doing something wrong with Carly?
No, sir.
So all of those factors that you knew before speaking with Stephen didn't raise any spidey senses.
Judge, objections to form the question and is argumentative.
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Let me ask you this. Would it be fair to say that when you saw Stephen's injuries by the first interview then, that your spidey senses were going off?
Judge, objections to form the question and is argumentative.
The objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
No, sir.
Do you remember testifying at the second grand jury hearing in this matter, right?
I don't recall the date, but yes, sir.
Okay. And this is page 82 of that. I'm going into 83, starting at line 18.
I'm sorry, what page?
Page 82, lines 18, and it goes into page 83. Isn't it true that one of the grand jurors asked you a question about those injuries and whether it raised any red flags to you? And your answer is suspicion. I've been doing this job for a while, and I guess, like the term everybody uses, spidey senses. Just something in the back of your head, back of your mind, something is just not right. Wasn't that your testimony back then?
I object to a proper impeachment process.
The objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
I would have to look at the transcript, sir, but I can't
May-
say
may-
for
may I approach?
verbatim.
You may proceed.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now detective, has your recollection been refreshed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now isn't it true that the grand juror asked you about red flags going off, and your answer is about suspicion? I've been doing this for a while, and I guess, like the term that everybody uses, spidey senses, right?
And I do object because this is taken out of context, so it's vague at this point.
I'll be happy to put it in context.
All right. Well, I'll sustain the objection on doctrine of completeness.
Okay. Now, you'd agree with me that this grand juror asked you questions, is asking you questions specifically about the injuries on his hands and the red flags that raises for you, right?
Your Honor, my objection is vague and also the doctrine of completeness because this goes to the third interview on the 28th, not the first interview on February
The
12th.
His objection was context. I'm putting it in context.
That's not the context, Your Honor.
The objection is sustained.
Do you know the context that question was asked in?
No, sir.
Would looking at the transcript refresh your recollection?
Yes, sir.
May I approach?
You may.
And Your Honor,
We
the
can start at
context should
line
be
12.
page 81 to 82 would be the proper context.
Line
On the
80,
subject.
Do you
line,
have those pages with you? Obviously, you just have a portion of it in your hand.
well, the context starts at line, page 82, line 10.
Your Honor, I object because that is not the context of it.
Well, let's present you with the transcript rather than a page.
May I approach now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to give you the testimony that starts on page 81. You can read as much as you like with it. You ready? what's said afterwards, wouldn't you agree?
I don't understand the context.
What we're talking about is the impact of your observations of the injuries setting off your spidey senses. Isn't that the context?
During the first interview?
No, during this question, back in the second grand jury hearing. Wasn't that the context you were asked about your spidey senses in? Was in the context of your observations of Stephen's injuries?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that's because these marks looked fresh and recent?
Yes, sir.
And so that's why your spidey senses were going off, right?
Yes, sir.
And your testimony is that those spidey senses, and just to be clear, when that grand juror asked you about those spidey senses, you characterized it as suspicion, right?
Yes, sir.
That was your word, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
So wouldn't it be fair to say, if you saw these injuries by the first interview, you were suspicious of Stephen by the first interview?
I wouldn't say suspicious, sir.
Didn't you just say the spidey senses is suspicion?
There's objection that goes, here's where it's vague and ambiguous as to which interview counsel is referring to with respect to the spidey senses.
Are you confused? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, excuse me. I'm going to overrule the objection. The question is, that was presented to the witnesses, so wouldn't it be fair to say if you saw these injuries by the first interview, you were suspicious of Stephen by the first interview?
I mean, that was your word, suspicion, right?
Well, that's a
Judge, I
that-
object, Your Honor.
Yeah, well,
That's improper.
That was the question before the witness. I overruled the objection, unless you're withdrawing the question and asking a new question.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I didn't know.
He hasn't answered that question. Would you like the question repeated?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The question that you were asked was, so wouldn't it be fair to say if you saw these injuries by the first interview, you were suspicious of Stephen by the first interview? That's the question you may answer.
I was suspicious of the injuries, sir.
And that's what led to your conclusion of him being a suspect by that morning, right?
No, sir.
Okay, I want to talk about, carry on about things that you did as a primary investigator in your pursuit to find Carly. Okay, so you do the first interview about 8:24ish in the morning, second interview at about 11 a.m. And those are both interviewing Stephen, right?
Yes, sir.
From there, at about 1 p.m. on February 12th, what do you do?
After I interviewed him again.
Correct.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. After that second interview at 11 something, what do you do?
I asked for a consent to search of his vehicle.
Okay, and does he give you the consent?
Yes, sir.
And what do you do?
He drives his vehicle from the front to the back of the police station by motor pool. He's present with us. and we look in his vehicle.
Okay, and just to be clear, by that time, you did read him his Miranda rights, correct?
Yes, sir.
So to be clear, your next course of action is to search his car, right?
Yes, sir.
Prior to searching his car, do you, well, strike that. And did you do anything else in your investigation relative to this missing persons case on February 12th, 2014, after searching his vehicle?
No, sir.
And you search his vehicle. If you started about 1, do you remember about what time you guys finished?
Not the exact time. No, sir.
Okay. Do you contact any of those last known family members to have seen Carly at any point on the 12th?
No, sir.
Would it be fair to say that that would be because you're solely focused on Stephen in your investigation at that point?
No, sir.
Does anything happen in your investigation on February 12th, 2014 after you searched Stephen's car?
Later on that evening, yes, sir.
And what are you referring to?
When I got notified by my lieutenant that they possibly found Charlie's vehicle at Piahi.
Now let me ask you, are you still trying to find a missing person, or are you trying to make a case against Stephen at this point?
I'm trying to find a missing person, sir.
Okay. Because you'd agree, well, let me ask you this, what was the next thing that you did in your investigation then?
After I searched his vehicle?
Right. What was your next assignment?
I don't believe there was anything.
Well, on February 12th, would that have been the day that the vehicle was found out in Jaws?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so did you respond to that scene? I think you testified, right?
Yes, sir.
And that would have been 6:30-ish that evening?
Around there, yes, sir.
Okay, so that's the next thing you did in the course of your investigation to find Carly Scott, was that you responded to the scene over at Piahi?
Yes,
Would that
sir.
be accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now let me ask you this. Between the time that Stephen left with his vehicle after being searched and the time that you respond to Piahi, did you do any hands-on search for Carly?
No, sir.
But you get the assignment to go to Piahi. Who gave you that assignment?
My lieutenant.
And I guess why were you called on that?
Because at that time I was the primary detective.
Okay. And I guess how was the connection made that you ought to be there though? Did somebody determine it was her car before you got there or something?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
Okay. And so when you show up, is it like that scene that I talked about where the crime scene's already preserved, or do you show up there before the crime scene's preserved and all that?
No, the crime scene was already preserved.
Okay. And this is a task in your investigation that was not exclusive to you, this included other officers and detectives responding to that scene as well. Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
So this is not like any kind of hands-on activity on your part as the primary investigator to go find Carly. This was just something that everybody was assigned to based on what was discovered, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And, you know, for example, this included other detectives, special response team members, I guess crime reduction unit members showed up?
Not that night, no, sir.
Okay. That would have been the next day for the search?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So in terms of your role as the primary investigator, you respond to Peahi and you basically have to stay there till about midnight processing the scene with Anthony Earls. Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
And we'll touch more about that tomorrow. But aside from that assignment on February 12th, was there anything else that was done in your investigation on February 12th subsequent to that? I guess it would have gone to the 13th by then. Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry. You testified that, I guess, after you guys left that Jaws scene, you followed the car to Kihei Station. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
So that would have taken us into February 13th, the early morning hours?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you guys get the car over to the Kihei Station, and what do you do?
We secured in the impound lot.
Okay. And you call it a night?
Yes, sir.
Okay. On the 13th, so that same day later on, what do you do?
Well, before we call it, I need to preface, before we call it a night, I talked to the lieutenant about gathering up additional personnel so in the morning we can go search the Peahi area.
Okay, let me ask you this. I guess in preparation for that, and up to that time point where you're speaking with your lieutenant before you call it a night, had you spoken still with the people or the family members who are known to have last seen her, at least relative to what she was last wearing, so that that search could be looking for what she was last wearing?
No, sir.
Okay, and so on the 13th, what do you do as for your investigation?
That morning, all of us, the members of the police department, you know, the SRT, the crew, the detectives, we meet at the Wailuku station. We set up the game plan, where to search, what search groups would be searching where, and then after that briefing, we head out to the Peahi area.
Okay, and then what?
Then we get to the Peahi area, everybody has their assignments, and we just start searching that area.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward, but let me ask you this in that attempt. In addition to the search of Peahi area, you guys also follow that up with a search of Hana Highway. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes, sir.
And then ultimately at some point, not particularly on that day, but there are both items of evidence as well as remains found as part of this investigation, right? terms of clothes, the blanket and all of that. That was found in subsequent days, right?
In subsequent days, yes, sir.
And those were found as part of this larger search by police officers, including members from the Special Response Team, detectives, patrol officers, and crime reduction unit members. Would that be accurate?
Depending on what items you're inquiring about.
Okay. Well, okay, so some of those items were found by family members and some were found by MPD.
Objection,
Would that be accurate?
objection, foundation, speculation.
The objection is
Well, you know how they were found, right? All of the items, the blanket, the skirt, all of that.
Objection, foundation, speculation.
Well, that's
the
why
objection is sustained.
I'm laying the foundation. I'll just move on. Okay, I want to fast forward because I want to talk about what you do independent of what the group does, okay?
Objection is vague, Your Honor.
The objection is sustained.
Okay. Aside from the searches that you participated in as a group with other Maui Police Department personnel, you conducted further investigation as part of your primary investigator role in this missing persons case, correct?
Yes, sir.
I want to talk about the people you interviewed and the purpose of those interviews. Because after these things are found, the first person you interview is a person by the name of Shelly Tumbaga, correct?
I don't know if she's the first person I interviewed.
Well, let me ask you, with taking a look at your report, be able to refresh, well, let me ask you, do you know what order you took witnesses in?
I would have to refer back to my report.
Okay, with taking, may I approach you now?
You may do so.
Okay, has your recollection been refreshed?
Yes, sir.
Would it be fair to say that the first interview of a witness that you do is Shelly Tumbaga?
Shelly Tumbaga wasn't a witness, sir.
Well, you interviewed her, right?
I received a telephone call from her. Yes, sir.
On February 19th, you spoke with her?
Yes, sir.
2014, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, you'd agree with me that the whole topic of your discussion with her was about Stephen Capobianco, right?
No, sir.
Would it have been about her not seeing Stephen Capobianco's vehicle, or whether she saw Stephen Capobianco's vehicle out on the road to Hana?
Judge, objection, hearsay.
The objection is sustained.
Would it be fair to say that your intent when questioning Ms. Tumbaga was to question her on the topic of whether Stephen's vehicle was observed on the Hana Highway, like Stephen had represented, it was stalled on Hana Highway?
Objection calls for hearsay.
The objection is sustained.
Your Honor, this goes to his intent relative to the questions, not the question.
Right, I understand.
Well, let me ask you this. Well, actually, I can move on. To your knowledge, well, actually, let me ask you about Shelley Tumbaga. Do you ask her questions when she calls you?
No, sir.
So is it your testimony that she mentioned Stephen Capobianco's name to you? You don't mention it to her in any question?
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
The objection is sustained.
Okay. Well, the first person you speak with in terms of that, well, let me make sure I understand what you said there. You're saying she's not a witness to anything in this case?
No, sir. She called me.
No, I understand, but are you saying she's not a witness to this case?
No, sir.
Your testimony is that Shelley Tumbaga has no valuable information at all relative to this case?
Objection, Ms. State's testimony.
The objection is sustained.
What do you mean by Shelley Tumbaga is not a witness?
She had information to provide to me.
Well, I mean, do you define a witness by whether they call you or whether you call them?
Depends on your terminology of a witness.
What's your terminology of a witness?
Somebody that actually saw something happen or has knowledge of something happening.
You took her phone call and you spoke with her, right?
Yes, sir.
Are you saying she doesn't have any knowledge about anything that's relevant to this case?
She had some relevance. Yes, sir.
Doesn't that make her a witness?
Objection, I trust that asks for a legal conclusion, Your Honor.
The objection is sustained.
I mean, let me ask you this. Wouldn't it be fair to say that if Stephen tells you this story about his car being stalled out in Hana Highway, that by the time you're speaking with Shelley Tumbaga, you're trying to discredit what Stephen's telling you?
Objection, Your Honor. I'm not sure if that's a hypothetical. It is. It's improper. It's also speculation, and it's based on hearsay.
I will sustain the objection to the question as phrased. You may rephrase it if you wish.
Do you know Shelley Tumbaga?
No, sir.
You didn't know her before she called you?
No, sir.
Okay. Who's the second person you interviewed? Who's the next person you interviewed as part of this investigation after Shelley Tumbaga?
I believe it's Ashley Silva.
Oh, let's talk about Ashley Silva. You'd agree with me that your intent with speaking with Ashley Silva was to talk about Stephen Capobianco and not Charlie Scott, right?
Objection is based on hearsay, Your Honor.
The objection is overruled.
I'm sorry.
Wouldn't you agree with me that the purpose for interviewing Ginseng Mueller was to talk about, I'm sorry,
Okay.
your purpose in speaking with Ashley Silva was to talk about Stephen Capobianco, not Carly Scott, right?
Yes, sir.
And this Ashley Silva interview, do you know when that took place?
I have to review my report, sir.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may do so.
Oh, do you know when the date of Ashley Silva's interview was?
Yes, sir.
What was that date?
February 24th, 2014.
Okay, now, you'd agree with me that you had a interview with a Ginseng Mueller before that date?
Yeah.
Was that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that would have been what date?
Can I look at that?
Yeah, if you're welcome. Refresh your record. What date would that have been?
February 21st,
Okay.
2014.
Okay, so actually, the interview with Ginseng would have been before the interview with Ashley? Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
And so that would have been the interview between Shelley Tumbaga and Ashley Silva? Does that sound accurate?
Yes, sir.
Now, you'd agree with me that relative to your interview of Ginseng Mueller on February 21st, your intent and your questions for that interview was all about Stephen Capobianco, not about finding Carly Scott, right?
Judge, I object as to what the context of that interview would be as to hearsay.
I'm going to overrule the objection. You may answer the question.
What was the question again, sir?
You would agree with me that your intent in questioning Ginseng Mueller was to question him about Stephen Capobianco, not about finding Carly Scott.
Yes, sir.
And that was on February 21st of 2014, right?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this, because this is 2 days after you meeting with Stephen. Are you still searching for Carly Scott, or are you trying to build a case against Stephen Capobianco by February 21st?
By that time, sir, we were looking at Stephen. Yes, sir.
As your sole suspect to a crime that has not been committed as of that time, right? Are you saying that there was a crime committed by that then?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we can leave it at that. Because that was by the 21st, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now I want to talk to you about the next interviews that you do after the 24th. Because that finally gets around to at least one of the people who was last with Carly, right?
Yes, sir.
Who would have been able to tell you a long time ago, as early as the 10th, what she was last wearing, for example, right?
Objection on calls for hearsay.
Calls for, no, that's,
It also calls
It's not asking for hearsay.
It also calls for speculation. The information is hearsay, speculation is the what
The
it is.
objection is sustained.
Thank you.
and in fact, well, let's put a name to that. You interview Phaedra Weiss on February 24th, 2014, right? And if looking at your report,
Yes, I gotta look at my report.
okay, would that be accurate that that interview took place on the date of February 24th?
Yes, sir.
And not only actually was that an interview with Phaedra, Carly's sister, but that interview included Kimberlyn Scott sitting in, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I want to ask you about that before we go any further. Because obviously, they were not suspects at that time, right? Phaedra or Kimberlyn, correct?
They were not suspect?
Right.
No, sir.
And that's why you had no problems interviewing them together, correct?
The mom wanted to be present with Phaedra, and Phaedra had no objections to it.
And how do you know that the mom wanted to be present?
She told me.
The mom told you?
Yes.
In no uncertain terms?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this. When you interview witnesses as a policeman or an investigator, what is the ideal way of assuring the integrity of interviewing a witness?
Objection, foundation, and speculation.
The objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
What was the question, yes, sir?
When interviewing a witness, well, actually, when interviewing a suspect, do you interview suspects together with people?
No, sir.
Why is that?
We want to hear what that person has to say.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that it's much like that yellow tape that's put around a crime scene, that you want to sequester a witness so that information doesn't flow from that witness to other witnesses and from other witnesses to him in that interview room?
Yes, sir.
Tell me about that. What is that all about? What are you trying to prevent?
I guess you're trying to ask collaboration.
And the fact is, it's easy to corroborate, or would corroborate be the more accurate word?
I don't know.
I mean, collaborate means what to you?
It means they get together and
Oh, okay. What does corroborate mean to you?
cooperate means that what I have, what they tell me, both match.
Okay. Now, does interviewing one person versus two people or three people at a time have an impact relative to the integrity of witness statements and interviews?
If you're saying 3 people at one time, yes, sir.
What about 2 people at one time?
It may.
I mean, you'd agree with me that in one way, as soon as you bring 2 people to be interviewed at the same time, you're pretty much eliminating them as suspects. You've already eliminated them as suspects, right?
It depends on the investigation, you know.
Well, but you'd agree with me that once you start interviewing people together, information is shared, and that makes it easier for people to know what other people are saying, right?
Yes, sir.
So would it be fair to say that you would never do that with a suspect?
No, sir.
When you say no, sir, what do you mean by that? You would not do that, or you would?
Would I have 2 suspects together in the same interview room? No, sir.
Well, put another way, would you ever have a potential suspect interviewed with another person in the room?
Other than a detective?
Right.
No, sir.
And in that regard, wouldn't it be fair to say that once you do, you kind of like spoil the integrity of the process relative to him being a suspect?
I don't understand the question.
For example, if there is an actual suspect there, and he's allowed to be interviewed with another person, that the integrity of that investigation has been compromised already because there's sharing of information even between those 2 people?
If there's suspects,
Well, even if just one of them is a suspect, right?
Okay, if I understand you correctly, if I have a suspect in a room, no, sir, I would not have another person present.
And there's a reason for that. What
Yes,
is
sir.
that reason?
So they cannot collaborate.
Okay. So, flipped on the other side, you'd agree with me that once you do interview someone who could have been a potential suspect with somebody else in the room, you're kind of already acknowledging that he's not a suspect and kind of taking him out of the pool of suspects, right?
Yes, sir.
And relative to this interview with Phaedra Weiss on February 24th, you do interview her with another person in the room, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you'd agree with me that relative, and just to be clear about this,
Judge, I object because there's no confusion as commentary.
when,
At this point, there's no actual question posed to the witness, so at any rate, I'll sustain the objection and ask that you begin to another question, please. It can be about the same topic, it just needs to be a question for the witness.
when Kimberlyn Scott insisted on being in that room,
Objection is hearsay, and I'm sorry, it assumes facts, not an evidence.
The objection is sustained.
you said that Kimberlyn Scott insisted on being in this interview, right?
Objection that calls for hearsay and it mistakes the evidence.
It's already been testified to.
It's hearsay, I object to it.
I'll sustain the objection as it relates to the specific language use in the question itself.
Okay, I think I know what the sequence is. Your testimony was that Kimberlyn Scott wanted to be in the room during this interview that you had with Phaedra, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, just to be clear, you had already spoken with Kimberlyn Scott how many times prior to this interview?
Several times.
So why would she need to be in that? Well, strike that, strike that. You'd agree with me that your intent relative to your questions to Phaedra and or Kimberlyn during that February 24th interview was to ask questions about Stephen Capobianco rather than questions about Carly Scott being missing, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the next interview that you do would have been with Brooke Scott. Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree with me, and just to put things in context, that is, what is Brooke Scott's relation to Carly Scott?
That is the sister, sir.
Okay, and then Brooke Scott's relation to Kim Scott?
Kim is Brooke's mom.
Okay. Where was that interview at with Brooke Scott?
My office in the CID.
Okay. Was Kimberlyn present at that one?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, you'd agree with me that your intent relative to your questioning of Brooke Scott in that interview was to ask questions about Stephen Capobianco, right?
Yes, sir.
And so the next thing that you do after speaking with Brooke is that you re-interview Kimberlyn Scott, right?
Yes, sir.
Where was that interview?
Within the CID office at the Wailuku station.
So even though you had spoken to her multiple times already, including another one with Phaedra, you decided to have another interview with Kimberlyn Scott, right?
Well, the interview with Phaedra, sir, to clarify, is Kimberlyn was sitting there. She wasn't answering any questions or anything. I was asking the questions of Phaedra.
So is it your testimony that Kimberlyn didn't say anything during that whole interview?
Not as far as answering the questions I asked of Phaedra.
Is it your testimony that Kimberlyn did not say anything during that interview?
She may have said something.
So if she said things, it was not in response to your questions then? She just would say things that she wanted to say?
Judge, objection, calls for hearsay and also assumes facts not in evidence.
The objection is sustained. It's also speculative in terms of what she wanted to say.
That's it, thank you.
What more did you expect from Kimberlyn Scott on another interview that you hadn't gotten from her in your prior interviews?
Objection calls for speculation.
Speculation as to what?
On those grounds, the objection is overruled.
And it calls for hearsay.
The objection is sustained.
Your Honor, the question was what information he was going for.
I understand that would be based on hearsay. If you want to rephrase the question, really.
Just cut to the chase about that interview.
Objection to commentary, Your Honor.
Well, let me hear the question. I haven't heard the question, so Go ahead and ask the question.
Be fair to say that your intent relative to your questioning of Kimberlyn Scott on this interview was to ask her questions about Stephen Capobianco.
Yes, sir.
The next person you interview is a person named Matthew McCormick. Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
And the intent in you questioning Mr. McCormick relative to your investigation was to ask Mr. McCormick about Stephen Capobianco, right?
Not entirely, sir.
So, Your Honor, this might be a good time to take a break.
All right, we're just about at 4:15. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to adjourn for the day. Thank you so much for your services, jurors, today. We will not be asking you to come in tomorrow. Tomorrow's Thursday. So your next court day would be Friday, and that would be July 8th. And I'll ask you to come in at 9 a.m. if that works for everyone. Does that work for everyone? All right, very good. Thank you so much. Please keep in mind my cautionary instructions here remain in effect. Thank you.